Okay, welcome back to the Zach Clark Show. Before we introduce today's guest, there's some rather big news out of the release recovery world, which is the company that I am the founder and CEO of, which pertains to today's guest. We recently acquired a company by the name of Manual Care. Manual is an organization that focuses on men's mental health. And for me, it's a powerful moment because it's something that I've truly been interested in. Our guest today, Matt Stefanko, is the founder and CEO of Manual. And I met Matt, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago when he was getting started. But we're going to get into that. All I want to say is release recovery, acquiring Manual. We're going to expand the scope of our services. We're going to help more people, and we're going to really lean hard into men's mental health, and specifically men's mental health on college campuses. So I'm going to stop talking about it, and I'm going to introduce Matt. Matt, what's up? How are you?
I'm great. I'm excited to be here. I think, we'll get into the relationship that we've had over the last few years, but it's nice to this office is familiar. The people on your team are familiar. So while this is obviously big and exciting and new and different and all those sorts of things, there's a level of familiarity that I think makes this also comfortable too. So I'm excited to dive in. I think it'll be a good conversation. I think we're going to cover a lot, and yeah, can't wait.
Yeah, I think for me, anytime I sit down with someone who's an entrepreneur in the space, you always kind of say well, why did you get into it? Why did you start? And your story is no different. So can you give a little bit of insight into why men's mental health is so important to you and why Manual has been and will continue to be so important to you?
Yeah, and it's been interesting, right? Because I think the original orientation did have this kind of conversation around men's mental health, but I think what we're realizing is that there's this broader thing happening with young men. You see it with the guys who are showing up. And so it's become this even, more interesting and sort of broader issue that we've started to think about. But yeah, I mean, look, the original orientation is very, very personal. I mean, I struggled with mental illness from a really young age myself, grew up in an environment where, I mean, at the time, right, the narrative was not, oh, I'm not getting help because I'm a guy or because of the way that I feel, masculine pressures or whatever it might be. It was just I'm struggling. I don't feel like I can get help. And so I just kind of kept going, right? Like a lot of people do. Mm-hmm. Got to college, like a lot of people who are struggling with untreated whatever. I had bad coping mechanisms versus good coping mechanisms. For me, it was mostly a lot of drinking, and not fun, a lot of drinking, but problem, a lot of drinking. Didn't get help until kind of early on in my career, right after, started in management consulting, still struggled throughout all that, really intense hours, always on the road. It wasn't until I was sort of 23 where I was like, oh, there's a pivot point here and we can do that story, if you want to. But, so I've been in and around the behavioral health field for a handful of years because I was really passionate about giving back to an industry and a thing that made such a positive difference for me. The orientation around men specifically and young men specifically was in a lot of the work that I was doing at Shatterproof. So I worked in Baltimore City's health department. Most recently, I was leading anti-stigma efforts at a nonprofit called Shatterproof that does a lot of work in the mental health and addiction space. And I kept seeing the data, right? 4 times more likely to die by suicide, 3 times more likely to die by overdose. I had this story of all of these men, whether it be the men in my immediate family, the men in my extended family that had these challenges that were never talked about, they weren't brought together. And so I started kind of connecting dots between what is going on with, me and my family and the men around me, mm-hmm. and the data. Why aren't guys showing up? Why in all of the work that we're doing with Shatterproof that this is the hardest demographic to engage, even though they're the ones with some of the most kind of negatively profound, outcomes, impact, et cetera. And then you kind of start looking out and you're like, well, what are young men getting, right? There are certainly mental well-being resources, things like that, but those typically don't cater to young guys in a way that they're excited about. And then you've got companies like Hims and other things, but those weren't providing the kinds of solutions that I felt were making really real sustainable, effects, around things like suicide, mm-hmm. overdose, et cetera. And so, I was never itching to start a company or anything like that. It was just this is a problem that's not being, solved. something that's really intimate to me, and I want to go after it.
Yeah. I think before we get into the like the nitty gritty around the current atmosphere in men's mental health, I want to go back to you as a young kid and what was kind of ingrained in you, what it meant to be a man, what you thought you had to or had to not do. Because I think a lot of those things are like remain true today.
Totally. Yeah. Look, there's a lot of like these stories are going to sound like much more rough and tumble than they actually were, right? But like, growing up, I was put into school a little bit early, so I was smaller than everybody around me. I had a mouth, right? Like, and I didn't want to take stuff from people, and so I was getting bullied, a lot when I was younger, right? And would have these kinds of moments where I would go. I mean, I tell the story of like it's kind of funny when you think it's funny and sad in the same way. Where like, how did nobody pick up on this? But like, where I would just like leave class in 6th, 7th, 8th grade and like sit in the bathroom and cry by myself for like 20 or 30 minutes. And you're like, well, that probably was a problem. But in the environment I was in, I was getting good grades. I went to Cornell. Like I was doing
public school.
Yeah, it was just and not a bad public school. It was just a good public school, right? I was just in public school, and they were trying to get kids to graduate and go to college, and that was never for someone like me off. Like I was always going to go to college, and so check the box, and no one's kind of checking in that and this was 20 years ago, so it's not like there was the infrastructure that we have around mental health in a lot of public schools today. And so yeah, you go through this all these stories growing up of times where clearly what I was dealing with was anxiety and social anxiety, and then getting into college, substance misuse and all these sorts of things. But at every step of the road, and I think this is where society is really good at this, and I think this is where men are really good at this, but in a bad way, we can rationalize a lot of our behavior as like, oh, like I'm not going to walk out of this bathroom looking like I cried, because what is that going to show to the people around me, right? I'm not going to admit that I have a problem drinking, because what about all these people that are around me that are also drinking a lot that don't have that problem, right? So you tell yourself all these stories as a way to kind of like lift up into that presence of being a tough guy, being a guy who's like desirable, right? Yeah. If you're trying to date, like all that stuff starts to come up, and you're like, well, I'm not, if I admit that I have these things that I'm dealing with, we think that is an indictment of that, facade that we're sort of putting together for ourselves.
Did anyone in your life know in 6th, 7th, 8th grade that Matt Stefanko was leaving class and going and sitting there? Because that's trauma, man. Like that's real. Sure. That's like a core experience. Exactly. I don't want
to. It's Stefanko.
Oh, Stefanko.
Is that?
Yeah, Stefanko. I should probably know that.
Should we like? Is it? I don't know.
No, you're fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
No. The answer is no. Nobody knew, right? I mean, I think there were a couple times like growing up where random like. I would go to a therapist or something like that, but it was almost always through the vein of like, you're asking your teacher too many questions, or you're doing like that. Like it was never this kind of conversation around like mental health, at least from my recollection, was never part of the conversation. Anxiety was never part of the conversation. I mean, I never dealt with anything that was in and around something like depression, but it's not like that was like, those were not the words being used. Maybe it was like, oh, ADHD or what, like there was some of that kind of like, that could be what's going on here. But for the most part, no. Like, and who was I going to tell? Like that wasn't the culture in the men in my family. It really wasn't the culture of it. My grandpa, he passed away recently, but he was a long haul truck driver. Like, well, I'm going to go up to him and say, yeah, Grandpa, like I know you're on the road all the time, and you're, my uncle like jumped dirt bikes and stuff. Like he would literally like go to like county fairs and jump over 13 cars, and I would go there. I'm supposed to go to him and say, no, yeah, I just like every couple days after I get bullied, I go to the bathroom and I cry for 20 or 30 minutes. What do you think of me, Uncle? Like that wasn't the sort of culture, and certainly I wasn't going to tell the boys around me that you're trying to get invited to sleepovers, you're trying to fit into that culture and be a part of that. So no, of course, who was going to be that person that initiated that conversation or had that dialogue?
Yeah, it's scary. It's scary, and I feel like this is something that we're finally paying attention to, and we're finally starting to see people recognize that bullying and adoption and some of these things that weren't talked about 10, 15, 20 years are it's traumatic, like they're traumatic things that finally I mean, I hope I'm not in the middle school environment. I'm not in the elementary school environment. But I would hope that teachers are more aware to some of the damage that can be caused by something like that. And
I think the scary thing, right, is, and I think like you can look at the opioid epidemic the same way, which is like our resources have gotten so much better in the last 15 or 20 years, but the problem has gotten so much worse, right? So it's like this. I mean, because we do, we mostly work with manual in a lot of the university settings. But we've started to do some work in high schools, and we're doing some work with some prep schools and things. It's been really interesting to go into that environment because I see the resources that those guys and those students have relative to what was available, 15, 20 years ago. And it is monumentally better. And at the same time, all the stuff that gets talked about, social media, it's so much, in some ways, it's so much easier to bully in private, right? At least like, when things were happening, like there were teachers around there, that people did intervene, even if they didn't, go through the steps of saying, hey, let's get you mental health resources. There was a network there of support kind of theoretically. Now all this stuff can be online. All this stuff is much more subversive. So we're making so much progress with the supports, but we're losing so much ground on like how much young people are struggling today. And like, that's where that's what it felt like in Baltimore, right? Like we're rolling out amazing things, and yet the problem, the availability of drugs, like you can't keep up even if what you're doing is awesome. And so I think that's where the challenge with youth and young people is like, we're rolling out some pretty good stuff and the problem keeps getting worse. So what do you do in that scenario?
So in high school, I'm always like, I feel like college can be the perfect storm, right? Because depending on your high school experience, you're working really hard just to get the hell out of the house and get to your freedom and get to this life that like, you almost want to leave behind. Like I had a couple classmates in high school. I'll never forget that. Like all they wanted to do was graduate high school and begin to like live their life in a way that they took some freedom back or whatever it was. And that was maybe because they were bullied or picked on or their home life wasn't great. When you were in high school, were you super motivated to just get out and kind of launch into the world because of some of the experiences you were having?
Yeah, I was excited to get out into the world. I don't know if it was this kind of like over rotation of like, screw my hometown. I'm proud to be Minnesotan. I'm proud to be where I'm from. So it wasn't that, but it was definitely like, I want to see more of the world. I want to get out there. I want to meet new people. And so for me, I think where like college became kind of a perfect storm was I wanted to just move, right? Like I wanted to absorb all of it. I wanted to, I did this internship in India at a nonprofit for a couple of months when I was 18. So I was exposed to all these things that I had never even got an inkling of, growing up. And now, when things are moving so fast, you don't realize how much the ground is shifting underneath you. And so like, I hadn't had a sip of alcohol until March of my freshman year of college. I dated a girl back home. I was like, I'm going to, be good, all this kind of stuff. And, we break up, and then all of a sudden I'm like, 2 or 3 months later, I'm like blacking out like a few times per week. And like but when everything's going, right, you're on the move, you're around, I'm around these incredible people, like brilliant people who are, still.
This is at Cornell.
Yeah, core people in my life. And when all that movement is happening, you don't realize how much has shifted underneath you. When things slow down, you can kind of see, my life's actually changing. At the time, I was just like, wow, I'm here, and I'm here, and I'm here. And so that energy was really infectious, and at the same time, like it prevented me from being able to see what was transpiring.
And in your childhood, when is the first or maybe it's high school, maybe it's college, the first time you think to yourself like, I might have anxiety or I might be a little depressed, right?
Wasn't until after college. There's.
So those words weren't even in your stratosphere.
No. I'm sure I conceptually knew them or whatever, but it's not like I was going up to people and saying like, oh, this could be a problem, or I'm a little like, I don't know. No, it was like, I'm stressed. This is what it takes to get good grades at Cornell. This is what it takes to be successful. I was trying to get these really hyper competitive jobs. Like that was just like, oh, like those are the, and I think this is, in a lot of the work we're doing with Manual and with a lot of these young guys, like the challenge is helping them define what is normal stress, what is resiliency, and what is like a problem, right? So I looked at the guys around me that were also drinking heavily because we were in college. And I said, and I could justify my behavior relative to them because I also saw them get drunk occasionally. Right now, they weren't blacking out 3 times a week or 4 times a week. They were maybe blacking out once a semester, right, or never. But they looked drunk to me, and so that was enough. And everybody was stressed there. It was a huge pressure cooker environment. So like, yeah, but oh, I'm nervous about my test. I bet everybody's nervous about their test, right? So you get into that justification mode. And so you never even get to the point. I mean, I always joke with Manuel, like when we go and bring this to the guys, we don't tell them it's a mental health platform. Mm-hmm. We talk about it as men's personal development, because how many guys are on college campuses right now that have a mental health issue that don't define it as a mental health issue? And if you say, I have a mental health solution, that's not for me. I don't have that problem, right? They're not even trying to like send a message. They just like legitimately don't think that's an issue that they have. And so, yeah, that was me up until 22, 23.
I think that's one of the confusing parts about mental health. And it's like with any, I mean, if you want to use the word illness, that's fine. And I don't think social media is doing us any favors, because so many people are talking about mental health now. It's just, it's so in your face. And a lot of that is really good. But, there's like low level anxiety and depression. And then there's extreme examples of, I'm not sure if I want to live anymore.
The way I describe it, right, and these things can and obviously a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last few years is so focused on these young guys, but at least in the lens of the problem that I think Manuel is working on, we have two issues, right? We've got a mental health crisis in youth. It's a real thing. We also have like a male disconnection, disengagement, lack of fatherhood, male role modeling issue, right? Like we have both of those things, and those things feed off of each other, and sometimes they overlap, and sometimes they're different, right? Sometimes for young guys, the answer isn't a therapist. It's peer connection or male interaction. And but because, and this is a lot of people who have big hearts who are trying to do the right thing, because of the narrative around mental health, we default so quick into that, right? It's, oh, you're struggling, therapist. And a lot of these guys are like, I just need a friend. I need a buddy. I need to be able to hang out with you. I mean, that's why I'm excited about it. Like, you guys are healthcare, but you're also community and connection. And like, that's where I see so much interaction, and where because that's how we think about it too, is like, when guys need healthcare, we want them to feel comfortable doing it because they need it. At the same time, we're dealing with a crisis that's like also separate from that is really profound, and throwing a bunch of clinicians at it is not going to be the thing that solves the problem, at least not in its entirety.
Mm-hmm. So you graduate college and you go back home, or where do you land?
So I'm in Minneapolis, but I'm working at McKinsey. Okay. So really intense job. I'm barely home, right? I mean, I think I racked up 250 hotel nights in the first year or something, right? So I'm on the road all the time. Terrible environment, right? You're sitting by yourself in a hotel room. I have stories, right, of per dieming bottles of wine, just drinking at the bar. But I mean, I'm like crushing work, right? I'm like.
And is there any level of support outside of like, hey, get your work done? Is there anyone pointing you to like, hey, if you're feeling burnt out, like go talk to this therapist?
It's an interesting balance. I think like it's a lot of really intensive environments. I think it's a place where if you are ready to ask for support, they have a lot of that support. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, like, the culture is intense, right? Like it is a busy, intense work environment. And so it's not like anybody's looking out for that kind of problem necessarily, right? Like they're assuming that everyone's a high performer. And so if you're willing to raise your hand and say, hey, I need help, I think it's actually probably a pretty supportive culture. But if you're just grinding like everybody else, they're not going to stop you. Like they're like, right. Yeah, like keep producing, keep being, great, right? Like that's what they want out of you. So I was not in a place where I was ready to ask for help. So it's hard for me to like say, oh, they would have or would not have done, more. But no, I mean, the culture was like, you're getting your work done. Awesome.
Yeah. I mean, the reality is, and I think it's very easy for us to blame organizations or places or employers or schools or whatever. If we ask for help, my experience is that you will find it. In one way, shape, or form. I mean, like if you are willing and you're at that place like I was at 27, where I knew that I had a real problem with drugs, alcohol, and mental health. And it took a bank teller. Like, it can come in a lot of different ways. But I think as society, what we are doing a good job of is making it a little bit easier to say, I need help.
Yeah, look, the not every environment is right for every person at every moment of their life, right? Like I was not like in a healthy enough place to be in an environment that was that intense, right? And like, I know I've said this to you, I've said this to our investors, like I've learned what my limit is, right? Like I have, just like everybody has limits for other things, like I have a cap with my mental health of how much I can work. I work a lot, right? I mean, you know that, but like there's a limit to it. And if I push past that, when I was at McKinsey, like I just pushed past that limit, and but I didn't even know the limit was there. And so I think similar to how, you know, certain people who, you know, that I've met who are in recovery have, you know, friend groups that don't fit with them anymore once they get to, you know, and you know, there's these places where if I want to be in a certain spot and I'm not ready or prepared to do that, that might not be the right place for me. That intense of an environment, given all the challenges that I had, mixed in with no coping mechanisms built in, just recipe for failure for sure. I think if I went back now with all the coping mechanisms, probably a different story. But at the time, no way.
So you do the McKinsey thing, and then you decide to yourself, like, hey, I want to make impact. Is that an accurate way to say that?
I would say the accurate way would say $135,000 of student debt says I should probably go get a job in consulting. I think I always wanted to do the impact stuff, right? I mean, in college, I started co-founded a nonprofit grocery store that worked on food insecurity. Like I've always wanted to do that kind of work.
Yeah.
So I think there was more of like a genuine financial, like means to an end kind of thing with the consulting thing. So I always wanted to work in, behavioral health was not this like calling as it is now, right? I think at the time, it started to become that because of the mental health stuff, but it was, I knew that I wanted to transition back into that work. I knew that I wanted to kind of get to the East Coast. Olivia, who we just got married.
Congrats.
Excited, thank you. But she was going to do her MPH and got into Hopkins because she's really smart. And I found a really inspirational leader at the time, Lena Wen, who's the health commissioner. I was like, I want to go work with that person. I want to go learn from
Did
that
you
person.
like seek her out? Did you?
So I knew that we were moving to Baltimore. I knew that I needed to get a job in Baltimore. This was pre-COVID, so like remote work was not like, you couldn't be like, I'm going to be in Baltimore, but like I'll do all my calls on Zoom. Like I know it seems like that, like it's not that long ago, but it was that long ago. And every single person that I talked to was like, if you want to work with a smart person, go work with Lena. Like everybody I talked to in Baltimore was
and
like,
she's a friend now, right? Dr. Lena Wen. So she like tell me a little bit about
I don't know. I hope that I consider her a friend.
Yeah.
I think you'd have to ask her, you know. But yeah, I mean, she's been an advisor, you know, investor in Manual, all these sorts of things. But no, I mean, she was a really kind of formative part of my, you know, career arc. But that was it. I was like, I want to go work in an impactful space in behavioral health with someone who's considered a leader. And every single person I talked to said Lena, and so that was sort of that.
Sweet. So you work there for a little bit. You end up at Shatterproof for a couple years. You grow their stigma campaign. Is that the way you say it? Or
so it's the division is the National Stigma Initiative, right? So Shatterproof does a lot of cool stuff, including some policy work, some treatment quality work. But then, you know, Gary's story, who's the CEO, is that
Gary Mendel, who
really prominent in the space. A lot of people, I'm sure, know him that are listening. But you know, Gary, you know, blames stigma as a really a key element of what happened with him losing his son, and so he wanted to take a really big and profound swing at it. I had gotten connected with him and was excited about being the first person into this new thing. He was like, go build it. And Gary's built a lot of stuff in his career, and so to be able to like learn about how to build something from someone who's built a lot of things was like a really nice, natural kind of, you know, place after working with Lena.
Yeah. And I think at some point during Shatterproof is when we met. You were hosting an event or a panel.
It was the inauguration stuff.
With Gary and and Lena, myself.
It
was an honor to participate in that. And then I think we kind of followed each other's careers. And for me, I just remember being at a place where I had just kind of come off TV. I had been, you know, some would say, given this platform and trying to make sense of it all, and at the same time, somewhere along the lines, you decide to bet on yourself. So I'm just curious to you, like, how you got to the point of saying, all right, like, I've worked for some other people, I'm gonna give this a shot. Like, I'm gonna be an entrepreneur. I'm gonna go start this thing Manual, and like, because I'm always fascinated by like the story of how someone gets to start the business.
Yeah, I still don't know. It's only been a couple of years, and I'm like, I can't believe that it's the fun thing about starting something is how quickly you can go from having nothing to something that's really real, right? I mean, like we had, this is like a total tangent, but like the other day I was talking with one of our partners, Clark Atlanta University, HBCU, and this guy was talking about an interaction that two students had. He runs their disciplinary hearings. and one of the guys was in the fight, and he could have fought back, but he decided to walk away. And he's telling me that like the reason the guy did that is because of Manual, right? And like within a period of 2 years, you go from like this student could have been expelled from the university, and because of our content and the platform, he's not, right? And 2 years ago, this thing didn't exist. So like that is a really cool part of starting something.
Yeah, that's why you do it.
But it has happened so quickly that I don't know if I have like a perfect pin on exactly when I decided, to be honest, and maybe this is the itch of starting something, like Shatterproof and the Stigma Initiative, Gary probably wouldn't agree with me, but I was like, it is in a place where it's going to exist. Like I had a number 2 there who now runs the initiative. She's phenomenal. And I was like, this is going to be good. Like I don't need to be here. Like I got like me and Gary and the team that we had built had got this to a place where like, this is going to exist. This is going to grow without me. This is going to be a thing that's going to impact a lot of people. And so there was both the itch around this issue of men and what's going on that I was like wanted to scratch, but at the same time, like the other thing that I had helped start with Gary and a lot of other people was at a point of like being established. And I don't want to say I got bored because there was so much stuff that was happening, but I just like, I made my impact, I helped, and I could go do another thing.
Yeah. So how does it happen? What's
like how? I mean,
yeah, the story, man. I mean, like you woke up one morning and said, "I'm going to do this." You talked to your fiance or girlfriend at the time, or you obviously went out and you raised some money. I mean, I think there's something very fascinating about someone following their dreams. And I know for me, like I just knew that I was always going to do that. Like I always knew that I would be an entrepreneur. I always knew that I had some leadership qualities that I wanted to tap into, and I loved building things. I mean, at the end of the day, I consider myself to be a community builder. I mean, that's really what I do, whether it's with our employees or the nonprofit organization or Release Recovery. Like, that's what we do. We specialize in community. And so for you, obviously you had at this point some personal experience around what anxiety, what depression, you probably looked at some of your things that happened in your childhood and up through high school and college and said, and you saw the gap or you saw whatever it was. I mean, that's what I'm curious about, like how you zeroed in on what Manual is going to be. Yeah.
So, I mean, the way I describe Manual, and I think this gets back to like why because I think anybody who starts something, and you just said it with community, like, you get up one morning and you're like, this thing needs to exist in the world, and it's probably not going to exist if I don't go and do it, right? That's how at least always been like, and that's when Gary pitched to me the stigma stuff. It was like, I knew what Gary said, this was not going to exist if I didn't go and build it. And like that, I loved working for people like that. The grocery store in college, nobody was going to do that unless me and Emma, who was my co-founder, like unless we were going to go do it, it wasn't going to exist, right? And so I just woke up one morning and I was like, I think this thing needs to exist in the world. The Shatterproof thing already exists, and I trust Courtney and the team, and they're going to do awesome. And so I'm going to go do this thing that needs to exist. But the thing that I decided that I think needed to exist had a really interesting kind of like through line to my entire career, which is when things started to click, of like the health promotion, the anti-stigma stuff. Like what became very clear to me on a lot of these college campuses was 2 things were happening. One, men and young men were having all of the worst outcomes, right? They're not graduating. They're most likely to drop out. Our split in college enrollment right now is about 38% male, 62% female. I mean, this is a massive like demographic shift that most people don't know about that's been taking place over the last couple of decades. Most likely to die by suicide. Most likely, I mean, you run through the list, right? And they're underperforming relative to their female counterparts by a pretty significant degree. That's data point 1. Data point 2 is a lot of these universities, a lot of these institutions have resources. They have counseling centers, they have academic advising, they have all that kind of stuff. The problem is men don't use any of those resources. So there's this very interesting combination of things going on where you're like, on one hand, this is the group that theoretically should be using these resources the most. They're actually using the resources the least. And so the question then became, and the way we sort of describe Manual is like, how do you build connective tissue within these institutions between where these men are today, which is in a place where they don't feel comfortable seeking help for whatever reason, and all of the things that exist, right? And that was like that is what we wanted to go and build. And that was in a lot of ways like something that we thought was different than a Hims or Andrew Tate or all these other like, things that are out there that a lot of men, become attracted to. They always pitch themselves as the solution. And we were like, we don't need to be the solution. We need to get men to a place where they're comfortable absorbing all of these solutions that are there for them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the questions that always rattles around in my head when we talk about men's mental health and just what I'm seeing in the world today, and I'm curious how you feel about this in terms of manual and just the overall resources that are available in the world. And it goes back to some of the stuff I talked about in social media. Do you feel like we will go too far? Like, do you feel like we might go too, like, and almost get, like, I don't want to use the word soft, but for me, is there like too much mental health? Is there too, like, because there was parts of like growing up with my dad who was like a guy's guy that I value and benefit from in my life today.
Yeah.
You know,
the way we at least think about it, right, is it's not about, and this is I think where a lot of men that we interact with have that same. I mean, talk about guys who are guys. I mean, we work with fraternity men at the University of Alabama, right? Like they ask these same sorts of questions, right? And the answer that I always give is like, what we don't want to do, and this is what they fear is happening. We're not necessarily saying that some of those core traits that you're getting from your father or whatever are bad, right? Like wanting to be a provider, wanting to be tough and like those aren't like we don't need to demonize those things as traits, right? If that's what you see as masculinity and that's something that you're proud of, you want to be a provider for your family, you want to be tough in adverse situations. I don't think saying we want more mental health care is an indictment of any of those things. What I think it's saying is, are you actually being a provider to your family when you're not opening up? Are you actually being tough when you don't seek out resources around you? Right now, if you're well-adjusted, if you've got a great community around you, if you know when you're pushing yourself too far, if you've checked all those boxes and you say, I think I'm tough enough, I don't need, mental health care, you're probably right? You're probably like, but most men that are saying I'm too tough, I don't need mental health care, they're not hitting that checklist, right? So that's kind of the way we try to talk about it, is like, if you feel like if you really do have these supports and you really know when you're pushing yourself too much or you're treating the people around you not well, like if you've got a real read on that and you prize being a provider, you prize being tough, whatever those traits are that people associate with masculinity, then yeah, maybe mental health care is not a fit for you. Maybe you don't need that thing. Not everybody has a mental health issue, right? And I think that's okay to say. Most young men that I talk to, that's not what it is. They think that they need to put on a show, right? It's all the stuff about my story, right? They think that being tough is not seeking help, not seeking resources because relative to the other guys around them, they want to show that they can do it in a way that they can't, right? That is not a good reason to not get it. So I think that's at least how we try to distinguish it in terms of that kind of question on like, can I be tough or soft or whatever? It's like, you can just know what you mean when you say tough, right? And if tough is like absorbing all the shitty stuff and then taking it out on the people around you and hurting the people around you, it's not tough to me, even if you're not asking for help.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Like someone was giving this test there. They had asked me the other day, and it ended up being part of a psychology test, which is one of the questions was what's your favorite animal and why? And my answer to that question was the elephant, and essentially like don't mistake their kindness for weakness. Like the elephant is very like loving and caring, but will stomp on you and take care of business when they need to, right? And I thought it was interesting because I later found out that question is basically like how you see yourself in the world.
Yeah.
And for me, as someone who's very open about my story and mental health, I think both things can be true, right? Like we can be kind, we can ask for help, we can put our hand up and say like, I'm having a bad day, and still be like total badasses, you know, and be strong.
I think there's a level of like, you need, if what you're doing is intentional and you're waking up and you're thinking every day, when I do this, this is how it's going to affect the people around me.
Yeah.
This is how it's going to affect me over a long period of time. 9 times out of 10, the people who are doing that kind of stuff generally are good to the people around them. They feel confident, they're strong, all those sorts of things. I think that a lot of the guys that we interact with, they've never seen intentionality. They've never been taught, what it's like to take care of themselves. So they just kind of do, right? And the default for a lot of young men is the tough exterior, right? That's what they've been taught to show. Now, if that's an intentional decision, you think about that every morning, you think about how that's impacting the people around you, you're probably a good person that probably affects a lot of people in a good way. And being tough is not the problem. The issue is what I was saying before, right? It's that they're not doing those things intentionally. They're not putting in the work to know why they're behaving the way that they're behaving. They're just behaving. And that's where the problem often lies.
And I think it, it bleeds into fatherhood. I mean, the work we do at Release is fascinating. We run this family. It's not mandatory, but I would like to think every family in our system would want to show up to it. Family support group every Wednesday night. And for every 10 wives, there is one. 10 moms, there is one dad.
Yeah.
And we ask continually, like, where's dad? Where's dad?
Yeah.
Where's dad? And he doesn't want to do it. He doesn't want to feel. Dad doesn't want to participate. Dad wants it to just be fixed. He wants to pay the bill. And it's fascinating. And then when the dads do end up showing up and they do step in with 2 feet, like, they end up being like, they need the Kleenex. They're the most vulnerable ones there. And it's so beautiful to see. But I think at a young age, these things are instilled into us, and it carries all the way into fatherhood and beyond. And that's why I think it's so critical to be getting to the men when we are going to be getting to them in college, because we truly have this ability to create long-term, sustainable impact.
And I don't know, maybe I'm ruining a conversation that should be a strategy conversation separately, but like, I think we need to go younger, right? I think we need to be thinking about, it's funny. I made this joke to plenty of our partners of like, I thought by starting at 17, 18, I was like, oh, we'll get to these guys young enough. You show up and talk to an 18-year-old guy and you're like, oh shit, we're late. We need to go way earlier, right? So and we're working on things. For all of our fathers that are dealing with this stuff, think about the experience they had with their father's father. And then, so there's a lot of this layering that starts to happen. And there's so much work that needs to be done across all these sorts of things. But yeah, look, I think what's been a really, really amazing thing, and I tell this to the guys that we work with in these college settings, is like, in starting Manual and having these conversations, one of the things that's been the most profound is meeting the men who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s and saying like, the biggest mistake I had is not thinking about this until I was 45 or 49 or 50. Like, the way I treated my children, the way I treated my wife, the way I treated my friends, that was wrong for so many years. And these are, by the way, like, these are guys, you want to talk about, like, these are guys who people look at and like, that guy's a winner. And they're telling me at 57, I can't believe it took me so many years to ask for help, seek therapy, or just even like talk with the people around me about what I was going through. And so I always try to like tell that to the guys who are 17, 18, 19 of like, I have so much conviction that you are going to get to a point in your life at some point in the future and you're going to say, man, I wish I wasn't so stubborn. Man, I wish I told the guys around me that I cared about them. Man, I wish I took better care of my part. Like, you're going to get there. It's just a matter of how many years are you going to build up until you regret how many years you weren't doing that kind of stuff,
Yeah, no, look, I'm lucky enough where my dad is still very much alive and a part of my life. And the thing I'll say about that is I didn't see him cry until I got sober. Probably around my 1-year anniversary, we had a moment where like he truly got emotional, and he credited some of that moment to obviously like my strength in asking for help and getting help. But I will say on the flip side of that, he did at a young age like let me know that I was loved. Yeah. And that really, it made me respect him, and it made me want to make him proud, and it made me want to be someone that carried himself in the world like he carried himself. Yeah. And so that male role model is such a real thing.
We have a massive issue with 80-85% of the single parent households in our country are female led, right? So I tell the story a lot of like,
is that right? 85%?
It's a high number. Yeah. It's like
Holy
75,
shit.
80. Yeah. It's up there. Yeah. It's a very significant portion, right? Certainly the vast majority are female led versus male led. And so when you think about that, you think about like the proportion of teachers that we have, which trend female. You go to the college environment. I always encourage people to like just, look at where your child goes to college and look at the counseling department, right? And look at the gender diversity there. Look at the student support staff. So there's a real scenario, right, where you might have a young guy, grew up in a single parent household, maybe he didn't have, a lot of male role models in his life. He goes to high school, middle school, all of his teachers are female. He gets to college, right? All of the therapists are women. You're like, where would you even learn how to show up as a guy in a healthy way, right? Like that is like there are, if not millions of guys, certainly hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of guys that have that exact kind of trajectory where it's like the first time that they've interacted with an adult man is like the 21-year-old guy in their fraternity or the 21-year-old senior who takes them
or
under
a
their
boss,
wings.
like
totally,
like
right?
Scary shit.
And like that is good in some ways that finally they're getting it, but like you're kind of talking about a group of people that also has never experienced that, right? So you're all like trying to learn within your own environment. And so it is beautiful. What we're starting to see is that like there are young guys that are taking this seriously. I mean, we see like examples of men's groups that are being put together, but these are all things that are results of these guys being like they like wake up one day and they look around and they're like, oh shit, like there's not anybody that is like me or had my experience that's having this kind of conversation. That's a pretty amazing thing when you think about it of like, well, and then, the thing that this is my big, if I were to ever do a TED Talk, this is my big thing is like, we need to change the conversation from men don't want help to we are not delivering the kind of help that men need, right?
Yeah.
Because we so quickly look at the fact that men aren't showing up and we default to that kind of conversation of like, oh, they don't want this. And then, but when you take a big step back and you're like, well, who would have said to them that they need this? The answer could be there's literally nobody. And that's kind of a crazy thing to think.
The thing that's, I mean, like, I love that you said that. And I agree. And I see it in my life. There's probably like 3 or 4 guys in my life that I will get a phone call from like every 2 or 3 months. And it'll be something along the lines of they're drinking too much or they're feeling sad or anxious or depressed. And every time I will kind of like share my experience, which is like, I went to rehab, therapists, meetings, support groups. And immediately they're like, well, oh, I'm not that bad.
Yeah.
I'm not that bad. Like, I'm not doing that stuff. Like, this is just like, it's almost like they just need to say it to someone and then shove it down for another 3 months. And then my phone will ring. And it's sad because it's not a huge pivot.
But what we need for men is a middle space. What you're just describing is exactly what, I mean, we've got 50,000 guys on the platform. It's exactly the story we hear from these guys, which is, help seeking is very binary in their world. Big, scary counselor on a hill that I've got to go, I mean, when we talk with guys who describe seeking out a counselor on their campus, like it's a walk of shame. I mean, it's like, I'd have to wake up. I'd have to walk by all these people. They'd see me. What would I be wearing? I'm like, what? It's not, Sunday morning after a bad night. Like, what are you talking? You're going to see a therapist. But like, that's what they'll describe it like this, like kind of like walk of shame-esque thing. Right. And then, or I'm going to figure it out myself. I'm going to keep it bottled up. And when you talk with a lot of young women, what they'll describe is more of a spectrum, right? I could figure it out myself. I could do some self-help stuff. I know these sorts of tactics, or I could call my mom. I could talk to my sister. I have the women in my sorority that we talk about this kind of stuff all the time, right? I have friends that I could go to. And then maybe if I'm really struggling, my mom might say, why don't you go talk to a therapist, right? Like they have that kind of spectrum. Whereas a lot of these other guys, it's a huge jump, right? And so it's like you're expecting all of these men with all the context we just described, not having male role models, all these sorts of things, to go from I'm going to figure it out myself to like this big, scary walk of shame type scenario. And like it's a big leap for a lot of guys. And the fact that they decide not to do it isn't that surprising.
Yeah. So all the stuff we're talking about is kind of, because I want to take a second here and just acknowledge, where I was turned on to manual, why I believe in it so much. And a lot of it has to do with the things we've talked about so far. For me, I was introduced to you, as I said, when we were on that panel around the inauguration. Was it? So it was 4 years ago.
Yeah, it was. Like 20.
Biden's inauguration. So 4 years ago, was on a panel. We kind of started chatting. You informed me of some of the things you were going to be doing with Manual, and I will tell you, when I first heard,
I needed money.
You needed money, but
I liked you, but that was probably a big part of it too.
And we did. We invested. But here's the thing that kind of like the reason was I was jealous. I was like, this is an unbelievable idea, because for my whole career, I have been dealing with people, when they get to me or they get to release, they are in chaos. I mean, like it is 911. We got to go, and we got to go now. Like this kid is not going to make it. And this for me was a much wider entryway and a much wider front door. And you started to tell me about how like women were really kind of like sucking up all the resources that were available on college campuses, in terms of like the counseling center, right?
Yeah.
Like
In a good way, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. Well, they're willing to ask for help.
Yeah,
It's
totally.
not their
Yeah,
fault.
yeah,
It's just
yeah.
like, the services that are available are available and available to everyone.
They're using it in the way that we want men to be using it. Yeah.
Right. So Manual, as I understand it, is it's a software.
Yep. So it's
yeah. Why don't you tell the people what
Yeah.
Manual actually is, so we can 50,000 people on this platform. Well, what the hell is the platform?
Yeah. So it's a primarily digital platform. I mean, the way we really describe it, this gets like really silly, and then I'll actually explain what it is. But we call it like an engagement suite, right? But the idea is, how do we create as many touch points where these guys are, right? Which is often in the digital space, which is often unfortunately by themselves, and then sort of bring them to where they need help over time. So we have kind of three main components that we describe in it, all of it pretty much digital. And you're right. Like, I mean, what's exciting to me about Release is the depth. I mean, when you hear about the stories of the people that you've affected, you're talking about deep, profound change. We're talking about broad change, right? And so how do you marry those things together is obviously what you and I are thinking about quite a bit. But yeah, so three main components, right? We call it content, coaching, community, right? Are kind of the three elements. The content piece being that like we need, it's primarily video content. So think like Calm or Masterclass, but specifically oriented towards men. But we need content around things like mental well-being, substance misuse, et cetera, that uses the kind of language, verbiage, et cetera, that guys are excited about. And, you were in one of our, you recorded some of the videos that we had. I mean, in sort of our content library, we also wanted to get guys that guys wanted to become when they were older, right? They were seeing in a lot of the content and a lot of the things out there, they weren't seeing examples of people that they wanted to envy, right? Like I always talk about who our main competitor is, and it's like Andrew Tate and these like male influencers that are really, really scary, for me, from like a societal standpoint, like that, if that's the role models that we're setting up. But what Andrew Tate and people like that are capturing is telling young men, like, you can be like me, and they're just yearning for that. And so we need to meet them with content, with guys that I think are a hell of a lot better than Andrew Tate, and say like, you can be like this guy if you do this kind of stuff. You can be like this guy, right? Putting those people in front. So that's the content. Second piece is the coaching. So all the stuff that I was talking about, the lack of male-to-male interaction, we kind of wanted to just hack that, right? I hope and think we are moving towards a world where men are more comfortable calling up people like you and saying like, hey man, I could use some help or whatever. But until we get to that point, we need sort of a stopgap solution. And so what we have is text-based coaching. It's really kind of savvy, I think, how our team's built it. But pretty much any time you can reach out to a guy, a couple years older than you, trained, not a clinician, but someone that you can interact with and have a really good, productive conversation. And like, the most common conversation we have in those coaching, coaching conversations is a referral into some sort of care. Guys knowing they need something, but not being willing to say it themselves. I mean, we'll even have guys say like, can you tell me the exact words I need to use when I go to the counseling center and ask for help? Which is like, if you think about that, it's like, that's the barrier, right? Like for that particular guy, the barrier is literally, I don't know the sentence to say when I walk to the counseling center. And so by just helping him think about what that sentence could be, which is not that hard for our coaches to do, that guy's getting help, right?
Yeah.
Final piece is kind of this community element. We love the guys we work with. 18, 19-year-old guys, you can tell them something 20 times and they'll act like they've never met you before, right? So like, you got to be in front of them constantly. And so we're doing monthly live streams, we're doing weekly newsletters, we're doing all these little touch points that maybe those guys don't think of those touch points as particularly profound, but they're always reminders like, hey, this thing's here for you. We get a lot of feedback, which is fascinating, of like guys who never use the platform, but say that they are more likely to, like they feel like they belong at the institution more just because of the signal, right? The signal of saying, hey, there's a thing for you here is super profound for them. And that's how much they're yearning for something. So that's the platform. And, we launched it in October of 22. So it's been quick. I mean, we've only really done 3 full semesters of this. So we're still in kind of our baby stages as we think about this coming together. But yeah, 50,000 guys in sub 2 years, working with almost 50 schools across the country, some big, we're about to launch at University of California, Santa Cruz. We're at Indiana University. We work with a bunch of HBCUs. We have a really cool partnership with the, I always like shouting them out because they're like one of my favorite partners, but the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and working with their Men of Color Academy. So some really cool kind of partnerships and collaborations that we've been building. And it feels like we're just getting started. But yeah, we think it'll play a really, similar to how things like women's resource centers in the 70s and 80s, created a sense of belonging for women in universities that didn't feel like they belonged there. Same way that LGBTQ plus resource centers did that for, folks that, are in that community in the 2000s and 2010s. Like, it's a weird thing to say that men don't feel like they belong in these spaces, but that's what they're telling us. And I think Manual serves as one small thing that sends a signal to them like, hey, we're going to provide support for you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, the way that you explained it to me at one point was basically like, we're trying to reach the guy who's in his dorm room and the only thing he's actually capable of is like going on his phone and opening that. It's the lowest.
We call that, we call them like the college clock in, clock out guys, right? Like they go to class, go back to their dorm, they go to class. We do a lot of amazing work with fraternities, but in some ways those are the guys who are like the most connected. They have the most resources, right? Not that there aren't areas where we can provide additional help, but there's all of these guys out there who feel really, really disconnected, really, really lonely, don't have close male friends, don't have people in their lives that they're dating, right? I mean, there's all these trends out there of like lower dating rates, less friends for men. So all these sorts of things are like these guys kind of saying, hey, I'm like just going to kind of retreat into myself. And so as much as I know, like, for example, that the runs that you guys do on Monday nights, that things like that create more profound interactions. A lot of the guys that we're working with would not, like, they're not in a place where they're ready to do that, right? So
for people who show up at our runs on a Monday night, like, you got to be like ready to really like throw yourself into a social situation where you're going to be uncomfortable, where you're not going to know anyone. Like, I mean, that is like leaps and bounds away from like, asking someone, can you give me the words to go to the counseling center to maybe ask for some help at some point? Like, not sure if I'm even ready right now.
We'll get university administrators who are like, I hate phones. I don't want, and I'm like, that's where they are. I don't like, you can't wish that away, right? Like, if these guys are only going to class and they're only on these devices, you have to meet them there initially, right? Like, I hope that, the Manual is kind of this weird business, right? Because if we do our job well enough, it sort of puts itself out of business, right? Like, and that's hopefully where release and all these sorts of things come in. But the goal is to get men away from what we're doing, but they're so, I mean, to your point, they're so far away that there's a million steps between now and then.
No, in a lot of ways, I'm proud of Release. I'm proud of the two of us for getting to this point. I think it's going to be a beautiful partnership. I think our teams are just going to work so well together and integrate into one. And for me, like, we did this college tour, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, where we went to York College, where I went, but University of Delaware, University of Maryland, Rutgers, University of Penn, and we kind of like did some research and we talked to a bunch of men and women, and it was very, very clear that the women were much further along in the process in terms of identifying that they needed help, the ability to ask for help, like having a sense of community. And so since that college tour, I've had this kind of pull in my stomach to do something in a much more meaningful way on college campuses, specifically for men. And I always had, Manual, because I'm an investor and all the other things, like tucked away in the back.
Well, now we're getting you back out there, right? You got a couple more big college tours that are actually, and that's, I think, this is just a small part of the collaboration, but like being able to bring you and Release to the campuses in which we're serving, like that's going to be such a cool connection. And I'm excited for you to like meet the first guy who's like a Manual user, at one of these schools, and like, hey, I'm excited that you're here and I've been like that kind of coming together. I think is going to be really cool.
Yeah. I mean, look, I've been working in kind of that direct care world for many, many years now. And I think for us and for our team, and, there's impact to be made. And as I kind of transition and think about my legacy and how I want to leave this world, which is like a crazy thing to say, I think it would be a major disservice if we didn't think about affecting people on a much bigger scale, which Manual's doing. And I would imagine that 50,000 person number is only going to grow in leaps and bounds over the next couple of years as we kind of combine our entities. So I'm curious, just kind of some parting thoughts around the future of men's mental health, like what you think we really need, what you're most excited about with, this partnership, and anything else that you think is important for people to hear.
I'm excited for a lot of reasons. I mean, look, no one's asking me to do a podcast, and I don't think that's ever going to change. And so I'm excited about the voice and the reach and the conversation that we're going to be able to now have and initiate. So I'm excited about that. I mean, I've known what's cool about this is I know the team, I know your team, I know the culture you're building. I'm excited to be a part of that. I'm excited to bring something to it, hopefully. So I think that combination is really exciting to me. And I think I've always acknowledged, and you and I have had some real conversations about this, of like that breadth versus depth conversation. Like, I know that we often will send guys away and they aren't getting the right resources, right, for one reason or another. And so to be able to be plugged into a provider of care that can provide that, like, I don't think the future of, this sort of digital care or whatever is going to be entirely digital ever, right? There's going to need to be this marriage of providing that in-person support, that community with that lighter touch kind of digital engagement. And so being able to create that space for young men, I think, is going to be really interesting. I don't think we have the perfect answer yet. I think you'd say that. I certainly think that. But there's that combination of coming together that I think between a lot of really talented people that we have will get us there. And look, I think this problem is only getting worse, right? I mean, that's the unfortunate thing is there's going to be a lot of opportunity. I mean, gambling addiction, college dropping out is going to be even higher. I mean, we're starting to see the high school dropout rates with men. I mean, this problem, and what happens with all the men who dropped out of college 10 years from now. So all of these things are going to just continue to compound upon themselves. And so we're fighting an uphill battle, but there's not many people that I've interacted with that think more that we can overcome it than you. And so that's going to be a fun thing to
you got to have hope. You got to have hope. All right, toughest question for last, and this is, you might have a long answer. I don't know, but I'm genuinely curious because when I think about, the world right now, it's a scary place. And I want to put politics to the side because that, in itself, I think is going to really hurt the mental health of our country. But last week we saw, one of our an assassination attempt on one of our former presidents, Trump, and when it came out and they identified who the shooter was, it was a 20-year-old kid, and I couldn't help but look at the pictures and some of the things that I saw around this kid and think about Manuel and think about the work we're doing and the profile that this kid kind of falls into. And I'm just curious your thoughts. Like when you see that, is it a specific profile that you see kind of continuing to come up? Is this a kid that you feel like, maybe was bullied or picked on and like this is his cry for help, or is it just straight mental illness? Like I'm it's very sad and it's very disheartening for me, but I think if we fail to talk about it, then we're kind of doing a disservice to the work that we do.
Yeah, look, it's a huge conversation. Obviously, I think it's still early in understanding all the motivations and all these sorts of things. The reality is, and maybe this is a bit of a cop-out, but I think it's an important answer, is like the more and more we have disaffected young men, the more bad things will continue to happen, right? And I don't know where, and sometimes that could be a smaller bad thing, like a guy decides to drop out of college and doesn't go and get a job, and then has his own challenges. It might be something like suicide, and then in a very extreme case, it's something like this. So I think the reality is, we as a country, really the world, we don't have an appropriate understanding of what happens if we don't figure out how to support these young guys. And we're going to only kind of continue to see it, accumulate more and more, right? The more that guys don't go to college and drop out, the more that they feel disconnected, the more that they don't seek out resources. Like, those things feed on themselves, right? And so, I don't know what, like, I don't know the exact stuff, what's going on, right? I mean, there certainly has been conversations around mental health. There certainly seems to be that kind of disconnection narrative that people talk about, right? Like who is he going to, right? And so, yeah, I think that this is a really, it's obviously a very tragic and a very, big, like it's like a kind of I don't expect that this example to be the thing that happens a lot, but gun violence, sexual violence, domestic violence, all of these sorts of things, they come from a place of most of these men don't know what to do with themselves, and they don't have the kinds of supports around them. And so if we just decide not to solve that problem, I think we're going to hear about these things more and more.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's a lot, man. It's a lot, and it's overwhelming to think about, but it's also exciting because I do believe that we have the ability to make change. I mean, like, well, look, we wouldn't be doing this work if we didn't believe that, right? I mean, we have to believe that, and so I just appreciate your willingness to come on. I appreciate your willingness to be a thought leader and a thought partner, and I'm just excited for this journey and the work we're about to embark on.
Look, the shift is, amidst all the really scary news and the lack of hope, you know, you're going to be on some of these college campuses. I know you see these guys coming through your doors. Like, there are young men that I'm interacting with that, you know, I graduated in 2016. Conversations that would have never happened are happening now. And like, that's where we've got to kind of invest in, hey, here, we've got a shot here, you know? So it is very scary. These guys are really scared. I mean, we have we've got this guy. I'll leave on this positive note, right? Because it starts from a dark place, but it ends in a really beautiful place. The guy who leads some of the student groups at Michigan State, you know, campus shooting a couple of years ago. And he said, me, 19, 20-year-old guy, I mean, I imagine that, you know, we weren't doing that kind of, you know, I need to bring something like this. I need to create solutions around mental health for the guys around me because I know they're being affected by all this stuff and there's nobody else kind of reaching out to them. And so there are these guys on the front lines that are young, that are like fighting and saying like, we can chart a different path for men in our country that like maintains who we want to be, but also like puts us in a better spot. And you meet those kind of guys and you're like, oh, I think we got a shot here.
Yeah, dude. I mean, look, it's the perfect note to end on. And I've said it for many, many years, like counseling centers, therapists, like behavioral healthcare professionals, we are always going to be burnt out. We are always going to be busy. We are always going to be overrun. So what is the next kind of like thing in line? It's just a peer-to-peer support. And my hope is that, you know, by providing this platform and some of these resources to the kids on these college campuses, that they're going to start to love on one another. And there's nothing really more beautiful than that. So,
yeah, I'm pumped.
Yeah, pumped. All right. Thank you. That's it for today.